Inside there was a high-value target, and they had only one chance to get him out. But even their most powerful weapons, according to the simulations, couldn't even scratch the walls of that bunker. The operation was on the verge of being aborted before it had even begun. When faced with a seemingly impossible task, what is your first reaction? As hope was running out, the unit's oldest master sergeant asked his commander for just one ding – a hammer and 5 minutes. On a dusty plain in northern Syria, the sun hung in the sky like a white, merciless stain. The tent that had been set up as the Tactical Operations Center was a cool sanctuary, filled with the hum of air conditioners and servers in contrast to the scorching heat outside. But this coolness was not enough to reduce the tension in the room. On the giant screen that covered the wall, a live feed from a drone was streaming. A single-story, windowless, ugly concrete structure. A bunker. Inside this bunker, a high-value terrorist leader they had been after for the last 6 months was hiding. The intelligence was certain. The man had been lured into a trap. But now, the real problem was beginning. How were they going to get him out of there? The young and brilliant military engineer, Lieutenant Terran Holt, was explaining the situation with a cold professionalism, using the tablet in his hand. "Sir," he said to Colonel Matthews, the highest-ranking officer in the room, "the three-dimensional model we have created based on satellite images, leaked construction plans, and seismic analyses shows that this bunker has a non-standard structure." A complex, colorful model of the bunker appeared on the screen. The walls are made of at least 2 meters thick, reinforced, double-layered concrete. Inside there is a cross-steel construction skeleton. All of the hundreds of simulations I have run point to the same conclusion. Holt opened another window on the screen. In this window was an animation of a missile hitting the bunker and exploding in a meaningless fireball, creating a dent on its surface. "The standard anti-tank missiles we have will only leave a scratch on this wall. To breach this bunker, we need at least 2 GBU-28 bunker-busting missiles, and calling for air support will both take time and completely eliminate the secrecy of the operation." When he finished his words, a heavy silence fell upon the room. Holt's analysis was flawless, his data was irrefutable, and the conclusion he had reached was like a death sentence. The operation was over before it had even begun. The target was safe inside his indestructible castle. Colonel Matthews ran his hand over his beard in frustration. "So you're telling me it can't be done, Lieutenant?" "Not me, sir," Holt said with his unshakable confidence. "The laws of physics are saying that." In that moment of hopelessness, a tired cough was heard from the back corner of the briefing room. Everyone turned in that direction. There, not in a modern tactical chair like the other officers, but in an old creaky metal chair, sat an old man. It was Master Sergeant Stephen Simmons. Simmons was in his late 50s, but his body carried the fatigue of 20 years of war and countless explosions. A few years ago he had been seriously injured in his leg in a mine explosion, and since then he had been taken off active duty. He was counting the days to his retirement. He was participating in this operation only as a consultant in the hope that they could benefit from his experience. But no one was consulting him. He was nothing more than an old war wound in this digital war room. "Did you have something to say, Master Sergeant?" the colonel asked, his voice polite but a little impatient. Simmons slowly got up from his place. His face winced slightly as he put his weight on his injured leg. He walked slowly toward the screen in the middle of the room. He wasn't looking at Holt's bright, colorful simulations. He was looking at the simple gray drone image of the bunker. "Sir," he said, his voice as rough as gravel, "if you'll permit me, I'd like to take a look myself." This request created a wave of surprise in the room. Holt was looking at the old man in disbelief. What was he going to do? Was he going to touch that concrete wall and understand its secrets? This wasn't science, it was witchcraft. "What do you expect to see, Master Sergeant?" Holt asked, unable to hide his condescension. "Something that our ground-penetrating radars and laser scanners can't see?" Simmons didn't turn to him. His eyes were still on the screen. "Sometimes the most important things can't be seen, Lieutenant. They can only be heard." Colonel Matthews hesitated for a moment. On one side was his young genius, who had graduated from West Point with top honors, who spoke with the data he had. On the other was this old wolf, who had survived countless wars, whose body and soul were full of scars. His logic was telling him to listen to Holt, but his instincts were whispering to him to give the old man a chance. "All right, Stephen. Go take a look. But hurry. The target won't wait there forever." Holt accompanied Simmons to the operation area, thinking this was a complete waste of time. The heat outside hit their faces like a wall. When they came in front of the bunker, the brutal, ugly power of the structure became even more apparent. It was a man-made mountain. Simmons didn't put his hands on the wall and look for some kind of mystical energy as Holt had expected. He just began to walk slowly around the bunker. His eyes, like a geologist studying a rock layer, were reading the texture of the concrete, the subtle differences in its color, the small marks left by time and weather.
"This wall," he said after a while, "it wasn't poured in one piece. Look." He pointed with his hand to a faint vertical line where the color of the concrete changed slightly. "This is a joint. Probably it was poured in different stages of the construction, or a repair made later." Holt opened the original plans of the bunker on his tablet. "The plans don't show such a repair or a joint," he said confidently. "The plans," Simmons said, "don't always reflect the reality, son, especially in these lands." The old man continued to walk. Finally, he stopped on the north face of the bunker. He closed his eyes. For a moment there was a silence filled only by the wind and the sound of distant conflict. Then he turned to Holt. The usual tired expression on his face had been replaced by the sharp focus of a hunter who had found his prey. "Get me a sledgehammer," he said, "and give me 5 minutes." This request was, for Holt, the most absurd, the most irrational thing he had heard so far. A sledgehammer? What was he going to do? Was he going to tear down that giant wall with a sledgehammer? "Master Sergeant," he said, his patience exhausted, "this is not a medieval siege. We have modern explosives with a hammer. Just get me a sledgehammer, Lieutenant." Simmons' voice rose for the first time with that non-commissioned officer authority. Holt was startled. He didn't argue. He asked for a large sledgehammer from a nearby engineering unit on the radio. A few minutes later, a soldier came with a giant sledgehammer on his shoulder. Simmons took the sledgehammer. He weighed it in his hands. For him, this was a much more familiar tool than a computer mouse. Then he began his incredible, strange ritual. He began to hit the wall of the bunker with the sledgehammer, not with all his might, but with a measured rhythm. Thud, thud, thud. After each strike, he would stop and press his hand and sometimes his ear to the spot where the sledgehammer had hit, listening to the vibration, the echo that spread through the concrete. Holt was watching this scene as if watching the meaningless act of a madman. But then Simmons began to speak to Holt. It was a lesson. "Concrete talks, Lieutenant," he said, between 2 strikes, "if you know how to listen to it. The sound of a solid, homogeneous concrete is deep and short. The moment you hit it, the sound dies. The vibration is immediately absorbed." Thud, thud, thud. He hit another spot. "But if there's a void inside, a weakness, an air bubble, or worse, a poor quality, rotten material, then the sound changes. It resonates for longer. It sounds deeper, more muffled. It's like music. A wrong note tells you everything. Simmons was moving methodically along the wall. He was hitting, listening, continuing. This wasn't an act of brute force. It was a diagnosis. He was not acting like an engineer, but like a doctor, listening to the chest of his patient. And then he stopped, at a random spot on the wall, a spot with no features in the plans. He hit it again. Thud. But this time, the sound was different. It wasn't sharp and clear like the others. There was a more muffled, a longer-lasting vibration. Simmons smiled. He had found the wrong note. Again and again, he hit the same spot, the same muffled, sick sound each time. "This is it," he said, putting a large cross mark on that spot with a piece of chalk. "The Achilles heel of the bunker. The back of this spot is not as full as the other places. They did a repair here 10 years ago, maybe more, and probably, in a hurry, with poor quality material." Holt couldn't believe it. "This is impossible," he repeated. "There's nothing like this in the plans." Simmons returned to the operations center. Colonel Matthews and the others were waiting for an answer from him. "Sir," Simmons said, his voice firm, "Lieutenant Holt's simulations are correct. The rest of this bunker is indeed indestructible, but on that wall, there's a weak spot of about 2 square meters, a patch." Then he turned to Holt. "Just give me 15 kilos of C4 and a precision detonator, Lieutenant. Not the whole wall. We'll just blow up that spot, like a surgeon." This was the complete opposite of Holt's "we have to destroy the whole wall" simulation. This was a challenge of experience, of intuition, and the sound of a hammer against technology. Colonel Matthews was playing the biggest gamble of his career. He would either believe the scientific data and cancel the operation, or he would trust this old, injured, non-commissioned officer's incredible theory. "Do it," he said finally, looking at Simmons. Simmons placed the explosive with his own hands, like a sculptor making the final touch on marble, right in the middle of the cross he had drawn with chalk. He set the detonator, and everyone took cover at a safe distance. The explosion was very different from the giant hellfire in Holt's simulations. It was a controlled, sharp, and almost silent explosion. Just a muffled thud sound and a cloud of dust. When the dust and smoke cleared, the result was incredible. The rest of the huge wall of the bunker was standing intact, without a single scratch. But only at the spot Simmons had marked, there was a perfect circular hole, large enough for a man to easily pass through. The Special Forces team slipped through that hole like a ghost. The terrorists inside, not understanding what was happening, were caught by surprise and were captured without a single loss. After the absolute success of the operation, Holt went to Simmons, who was calmly cleaning his sledgehammer. He couldn't find anything to say. "The simulation," he said, his voice ashamed, "hadn't taken into account that repair job, that poor quality concrete, because it wasn't in the plans." Simmons looked at him. There was no victory, no pride on his face, just that usual tired wisdom. "Because the simulation reads the plans, Lieutenant. But a master hears the mistakes." On that day, Holt learned that the solution to the most complex problem does not always come with the most complex technology. He learned that sometimes all he needed was a hammer and an ear that knew how to listen. And he learned that even the most indestructible walls hide an echo that only experience can hear. For more stories like this, that tell how even the strongest walls have a hidden weakness that only experience can find, don't forget to subscribe to Unspoken Code Stories.